So here he is today, sharing his journey through his autobiography. It is certainly no wonder that a galaxy of eminent dignitaries is in attendance, from the Honorable Minister for External Affairs himself to the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and to the former US Treasury Secretary. I must also share with you that just 2 days ago, we had the Union Minister for Finance and Corporate Affairs, Government of India, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, the Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies, Government of Singapore, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, and the Chairman and Managing Director of Reliance Industries, Mr. Mukesh Ambani, join us for a launch ceremony in Delhi. And today we're happy to have many of you in Mumbai and many other cities join us for this launch ceremony. May I now introduce and welcome our eminent panelists and thank them for taking time from their busy schedules to grace this occasion. We are delighted to have with us the Union Minister for External Affairs, Government of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Welcome, sir. The Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Mr. Shaktikanta Das, and the former US Treasury Secretary and President Emeritus of Harvard University, Mr. Lawrence H. Summers. Welcome to all of you. The discussion that follows the launch of Portraits of Power will be moderated by renowned British economist and academic, Lord Nicholas Stern. A warm welcome to you, Lord Stern. Just before we dive deeper into the event, let me share a few housekeeping notes that I request you to follow very strictly to enable a smooth event. Please ensure that your microphones are muted as you join us to ensure that the speakers are not disturbed. Our program team will be monitoring the Q&A box. As much as we want this to be as interactive and as close to a live event as possible, we are forced to request you to please share your comments and questions, if any, only in the Q&A box, which we will open after the short panel discussion. We will try to take as many questions as possible, but please bear with us as we are pressed for time and may not be able to take all of them up. You are welcome to engage with our teams on social media. Please do tweet as we progress. Use the hashtag Portraits of Power, and join the conversations. Thank you. I'd like to now request a very special person who, despite being just 10 years old, has been lucky to have a rich-side view of her grandfather's life. Nandini Patania is a keen photographer like him and recently got a warm letter from the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, for her pictures and notes on the peacock and the owl that she had sent him. I'm told that when she isn't attending her online classes, she is busy learning to speak Japanese, a country we know that both Mr. Singh and Mr. Modi are particularly fond of. Nandini, could I request you to please open the forum with your remarks?
A very warm welcome to everyone present here today. A few days ago, I was delighted to speak about the release of my grandfather's autobiography in Delhi. And I'm equally thrilled to do so today in Mumbai. This book is about people, their ambition, and their success. Like Mumbai City, this book too is about dreams and hopes for a better and bigger India. My grandfather's book, just like him, has many flavors. Many aspects of his personality are reflected within the pages of this book. His interests in photography, in classical music, and in debating inspire me and motivate me to pursue my dreams. I hope to make him as proud of me as I am of him. We hope that this book fills you, the reader, with optimism. Thank you very much for gracing this occasion with your presence.
Thank you so much, Nandini. That was such a lovely message to your grandfather. And we thank you for having joined us and made us very, very proud of what all you do. I'd like to now request the Managing Director of Rupa Publications, India's oldest as well as largest independent publishing house, and the publisher of this volume, Mr. Kapish Mehra, to please say a few words.
Thanks, Rini. It's very difficult to speak right after Nandini, considering the eloquence that she portrays on screen and the confidence that she puts out. So Nandini, you've made it a tough act to follow. Your grandfather has written a book called Portraits of Power, which documents India. But I'm presuming you are the absolutely correct person to document him and his portrait. So great job on that. First of all, a very good evening to the Honorable External Affairs Minister, Dr. Shankar, Mr. Das, Mr. Summers, Lord Stern, our author, Mr. Singh, Ms. Pasricha, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. For us at Rupa, it's a matter of pride and privilege to have had the opportunity to publish Portraits of Power for reasons more than one. Not only because this is one of those go-to books that would be referred to for the next decade or two by people who are interested in the concept of India, in the journey of India, as well as in the makers of India, but also something that is not boring and verbose, which is filled with data and tables, but actually it is full of people and anecdotes. Something that makes this journey, therefore, far more personal, relatable, and therefore readable. I read some time back that a man is known by the company he keeps. And as I look at this Zoom screen, it is very well documented and visible that for this book launch, there is somebody who manages India's profile and how India is viewed across the globe, be releasing the book. Somebody who manages India's treasury being part of the panel discussion. Somebody who's been a part of heading an university which is globally renowned, being part of a panel. These are all shades of nobody else but the author, whether it's India's profile abroad, India's revenue internally, or the academia in him that has always been kind of hiding somewhere. I have always felt during my interactions with Mr. Singh that beneath all of that, there is also a Professor Singh. And I do know that the short stint earlier at St. Stephen's many decades ago, I'm sure he would like to return to it someday. But having said so, ladies and gentlemen, I must say that it is a great moment for us to report to you that within 48 hours of this book being released, it's climbed up the charts and it's today #1 in the political space on various websites. This is kudos to the kind of writing the author has put out. And most importantly, the fact that this is something which will be there on our shelves, not for today, not for tomorrow, but for time to come. Many congratulations to Mr. Singh. If there was anything else after a university like Harvard, there should be a university of N.K. Singh of higher learning. The poise, the grace, and the diplomacy that you put through is something that one wishes to imbibe. And I hope that some of it, sir, has rubbed off on me and my colleagues during this process. I once again thank you for giving us this opportunity. And I hope Portraits of Power Part 2 should be the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mehra, for your lovely words. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time now to reveal Portraits of Power. We have a short video.
Some memories, the action, the drama, or what I heard, what I saw, what I participated in, and what was worth pinning down.
May I request you all to hold your copy of Mr. N.K. Singh's book up to your respective cameras for the release, as we have Mr. Singh hold up his book too. Portraits of Power, ladies and gentlemen, from personal happenings to national movements, Portraits of Power covers it all. If you haven't got a copy as yet, log on and order one for yourself today. It's now available on Amazon, Flipkart, and Snapdeal, as well as on the website www.portraitsofpower.in, and of course in all leading bookstores. Thank you very much. I'd like to now request the star of the event and the author of Portraits of Power, Mr. Nandakishore Singh, to share his thoughts.
Well, thank you all of you for joining me today in Mumbai for the release of my book, Portraits of Power, Half a Century of Being at Ringside. This comes, as was pointed out, 2 days after a similar event in Delhi. First of all, I'd like to thank a few people who have continued to give me great encouragement and great support in writing this book. I'd like to thank my family, my wife, Prem Kumari, our children, Meenakshi, Abhijit, and Madhavi. And of course, support of Petra, Nikhil, Sashi, Gautam, Manpreet, and my granddaughters, Nandini and Shanaya. I want to thank my siblings, Shama, alas, who is no more with us, left us a few years ago, my brother Uday, my sisters Radha, Krishna, and Sonia. Their children, Abhinav and Malvika, Jaya, Amitabh, and Aditya. I'm grateful to the publishers, Rupa Publications, Kapish Mehra and his team, for the extremely diligent work they have done. Yamini, such a perfectionist when it comes to accuracy of details. To Farhad, for having promoted it on the social media. And to Esther, without whose assistance this book would not have seen the light of day. I'm also grateful to my peer reviewers for some chapters, Arvind Vermani, Pranab Sen, P.K. Mishra, Prachi Mishra, Radha Singh, Samser Sharif, Savitri Kunari, and Tarun Das. Finally, I want to express my gratitude to the distinguished panel, to the moderator, Lord Nicholas Stern, with whom I share a personal relationship. We are both co-chairs of the India Advisory Group of the London School of Economics and have really interacted in other multiple capacities over a number of years. To Subramaniam Jayashankar, with whom I share a second-generation relationship, as his uncle Jayashankar Krishnamurti and I were close friends at St. Stephen's College. We both equally share a love for Japan, on which and about which I have devoted a chapter. He will agree with me that the geopolitics described in that chapter has vastly changed, because I had never foreseen that Japan and India would indeed become strategic partners. I met Lawrence D. Summers, Larry to friends and Larry to me, many years ago in multiple capacities, when he was working with the World Bank, when he was working with the US Treasury as the US Treasury Secretary, subsequently as the president of the eminent Harvard University. I've learned a great deal from Larry in various aspects, not only of academic collaborations, but in management of the balanced payments crisis. Mumbai represents the dreams and aspirations of every Indian. And that is why it is called the city of dreams. Mumbai, in more ways than one, is not only a hub of art and culture, it is the home of Bollywood, but there is a natural entrepreneurial energy embedded in this city. Indeed, it is Mumbai's restless entrepreneurial urges which have enabled India to become a leader in many walks of life. If India today is not a mere nation of shopkeepers and traders, in many ways, it owes it to the entrepreneurial vibration of a city like Mumbai. Many of the people involved in India's 50-year, which I have described in my book, originated and flourished in Mumbai. Some of them are no more with us, like Dhirubhai Ambani, J.R.D. Tata, or others in the field of art and culture, like Nargis Dutt, Sunil Dutt, Pandit Jasraj, Kishori Amonkar, all of whom figure prominently in my book. And there are others who are not Mumbai-based, but whom I miss very greatly today, like Mr. Arun Jaitley, who had mentored me a great deal in politics, Isha Jadalawalia, with whom I had interacted greatly on many occasions, to the eminent lawyer Ashok Desai, the former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, about whom naturally this book has a chapter. I particularly miss him. I'm also nostalgic about the former President Pranab Mukherjee, who had written such a warm and affectionate foreword for this book and was hoping to be here on this occasion, but we lost him recently. Mumbai represents the quintessential Indian dream, this book is in some ways about that dream. It is about recalling circumstances which are durable remembrances and which are worth recording. My compulsions in writing this autobiography were spurred by the fact that my father, a member of the Indian Civil Service from 1936, and some of his very eminent colleagues like Lalan Prasad Singh, L.K. Jha, L.K. to many of his people who former governor of the Reserve Bank, who would have seen a lot during the colonial period in India, and perhaps in the struggle in the post-independence period, did not choose to leave behind a scrap of paper. I did not want to really leave behind my memories of events which I saw, what I heard, what I participated in, but to leave behind some imprint. In some ways, if you ask the rhetorical question, is this autobiography an encounter with truth? Is it a devastating account of people's failings? Perhaps not. I've tried to see the better side of human nature, understand the compulsions of people who took the decisions. A pessimist, we know, sees the difficulty in every opportunity, while an optimist sees an opportunity in every difficulty. My autobiography is filled with the same degree of optimism with which the Indian dream is filled with. This book recounts really, in a certain sense, the progressive evolution of India's highly controlled economy during my father's period, and more especially, what I had witnessed and also was a privilege to be a part after the 1991 economic crisis, thereafter its progressive reforms, thereafter deepening of the opening of India's economic and trade policy regime, then with a number of years with the Prime Minister Vajpayee and with the Planning Commission. And of course, as a member of the upper house of Parliament in India, the Rajya Sabha for 6 years, where I interacted with many people, some of which figure in the book, in the chapter relating to my parliamentary experience. The final chapter of my autobiography deals with COVID-19, the pandemic, and beyond, which in some ways brings the story to a full circle in one simple thought. Is this pandemic, the 1991 moment once again in Indian politics and economics, is a time to reset the button, is a time to rewrite the basic tenets of social contract? I believe the world may not be the same, even in the post-pandemic era. I've written this book, therefore, in the expectation that accomplishments are really not destinations, they are part of a journey. My autobiography is not about my achievements. It is about India's journey from a nascent stage of an over-regulated economy to a place where we can hold our head high. Many of the panelists will know this, of the kind of difficulties India has encountered. But I believe that India's destiny lies in fully embracing technology, of converting this challenge into an opportunity. For many infirmities in this book, for many lapses, or what has not been written, I take the responsibility. I have enjoyed writing this nostalgic account of 50 years and have enjoyed doing so. But I take the responsibility of any failings in this. And it is in this spirit I request you with folded hands to overlook these faults and to view it with forgiveness and with tolerance. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, and congratulations. I'd like to now invite Lord Nicholas Stern, the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government and Chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, to please moderate the panel discussion and introduce the panelists. Just a reminder to our attendees that you can post
May
your
I-
questions in the Q&A box.
May I interrupt you to say
Yes, sir.
that the most valuable panelist, I should have said something, namely my old friend and colleague, the governor of the Reserve Bank, whom I have described in my book as a quintessential Mandarin, as someone who is handling the complex challenges of the current crisis in India with equanimity, poise, and devotion, which is quintessentially Shakti.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So just a reminder that you can post your questions in the Q&A box. And towards the end of the panel discussion, depending on time, Lord Stern may take up a few of them for the panel to address. Lord Stern, it's over to you if you can unmute your microphone. And if I could also remind the other panelists to just unmute your microphone so that it would be easier for you to just respond to Lord Stern. Lord Stern.
Thank you, Rini, for that kind introduction. NK, thank you for asking me to join in this way. Thank you for a quite extraordinary book full of reflection, optimism that is so sorely needed, but also lifting our eyes to what's coming next and the extraordinary challenges of this coming decade. Thank you for your friendship over so many years. Thank you for your role as teacher. You are already an academic, NK, because you have been guiding academics like Larry and me over many years. We come to you when we need advice. And thank you for the collaboration in the work we do together for the LSE, but also in the book we did together on Bihar. So thank you, friend, teacher, and collaborator. And of course, author of this very important book. Now, I'm very fortunate to be moderating three such distinguished panelists. I'll introduce them only very briefly. External Affairs Minister Chanka is exactly that, External Affairs Minister of the most important country in the world. Most recently, he has been in the private sector with Tatars, Foreign Secretary, looking after the whole Indian Foreign Service, ambassador to the other most important countries in the world, China and the United States. Extraordinary diplomatic career, and I've already been learning from Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar. Jaishankar, thank you for being with us. The Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Shakti Kanta Das, Shakti to his friends, has of course been in that position already for 2-3 years now, an enormously important position, but previously he held the most senior economic positions in India in the Revenue Secretary, Economic Secretary, and has led analysis of taxation, including the GST, inflation, bankruptcy, and of course moving from analysis to action. So thank you so much, Shakti, for being with us. My very old friend Larry, I met Larry in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when he was not only a rising star, a risen star with extraordinary rapidity. During the 1990s, he was an international civil servant of great distinction, chief economist of the World Bank, and of course, a national servant as Deputy Secretary and Secretary of the Treasury. And in the last 20 years, he has been international public property, a great asset, and he has been involved, of course, as president of Harvard in the Obama White House, and a voice that we all listen to. So it's an enormous privilege to be a part of the panel with those three very distinguished individuals. We're going to do this in two parts, just 3-4 minutes at the beginning about the book and what you took away from the book, and of course about NK. And then we'll move to the second part, where we have 3 questions for each of the panelists, which I'll put as a group from quite extraordinary individuals who have been gracious enough to answer the questions. So Jaishankar, if we could begin with just 3-4 minutes. I know it could be so much longer, but on the book and NK.
Well, thank you, Nick, and let me say what a privilege it is to join you all today. I think the author, Mr. N.K. Singh, and I mean, in a sense, I would say I've known him forever. Forever, in my parlance, means ever since I can remember. We have a family connection, which he mentioned. In fact, as I was going through the book, and I must tell him I very appropriately read it on a flight back from Tokyo. You know, he said he wrote it with nostalgia. I read it with nostalgia because for me, this was not just his autobiography, it was also a biography of, you know, the Delhi I had known, the decision making in India that I remember. So there was a lot in it that I identified and obviously a lot that I learned. Now, we share some similarities, I must tell all of you. I mean, other than the fact that we are civil servants who are also sons of civil servants. We went to the same college. And in fact, we joined the same service. For those of you who haven't read his book and don't know, he initially joined the Foreign Service. And I think the fact that he didn't stay with us was our loss, because I've really not met a more natural born diplomat than him. Again, as he remarked, we share this great association with Japan. You know, it's something like, you know, a lot of people who go to Japan are taken in. It's really a great learning experience. And again, I must say, for all the time I have spent on the Japanese account, I learned something new from his book, which was that one of the reasons why Suzuki was cleared for investment into India was the fact that they were already there in Pakistan. So it was actually a kind of a political balancing game other than just a business decision. Our circles, of course, intersect in many ways, and the fact that we are civil servants with secret academic ambitions who finally ended up in politics, I think was also another meeting point between us. I very much enjoyed the chapter on the parliamentary experiences, and you know, some very, very effective pen portraits of people who are shared acquaintances. But if I had two big takeaways from the book, I would say one really pertains today to administration, administrative reform. He has, in the beginning of the book, I think it's around page 54, 55, you know, the changes which were made in 1969-70 in Indian administration, and how a lot of very dominant, effective, domain-knowing secretaries were shifted. Essentially because, frankly, they knew too much and said too much and probably stood for too much. I raised that because I think today that issue of administrative reform, of specialization, of delivery, of performance, it is something which is back very much in the reform discourse. And I think there he has given us food for thought. The other issue for me is the perennial issue, which is anybody who's into the subject of economic policy and economic change. How do you get that inside-outside balance right? How do you, how do you globalize enough and yet make sure that your national capacities grow as a consequence of, what you are offering to the world and what you take from the world? And this is again today, I think, very much on the public agenda as we look at FTAs, as we, last year made decisions on RCEP, as there are complaints about the hollowing out of our manufacturing. So these were two big issues. Once again, what a pleasure it is to be here.
Thank you so much, Chanka. And Shakti, please.
Thank you, Rini, and thank you, Nick. I must at the outset thank Shri N.K. Singh, the organizers of this event, and Rupa Publications for giving me this opportunity to be in this August panel, and also participating in the release of the book of written by Sri N.K. Singh, who is a legend in civil services in India, is a legend in government circles in Delhi and other places. In fact, I had a glimpse of it when, as member 15th Finance Commission, he as chairman, I as the member, along with the other members, we traveled to Bihar and Jharkhand. Wherever we went, there were people who were recognizing him very fondly and remembering his days spent in that district or that subdivision. So that was a kind of a field level glimpse I got of what Sri N.K. Singh was. Nandu Babu to many people, Mr. Jaitley, with whom I had worked very closely, would always refer to Mr. N.K. Singh as Nandu Babu. He would, when I was in Finance Commission and I had a chance of meeting him somewhere, he would ask, definitely he would make it a point to ask, how is Nandu Babu doing? And so that was, that is Mr. N.K. Singh. Minister Jaishankar said that, when he left, when Sri N.K. Singh left the service, it was envy for South Block. But I think he just walked across and became the pride of North Block. So that was a great transition. And I think IAS definitely owes a lot to the presence of personalities like Mr. N.K. Singh, stalwarts like N.K. Singh, who have contributed to the working of the Indian Administrative Service in the country and the contribution it has made over the years. My association with Sri N.K. Singh was in official association, let me put it that way, was in three places. One, when he was member of parliament, I was joint secretary budget. There were many instances where in various standing committees of parliament, I had interaction. I had opportunity to interact with him. And once I remember, after he spoke on the budget, and that time Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, the late Mr. Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister. So in the evening, he called me and he said that, did you note the points which NK made in the parliament today? I said, yes, sir, I was there and I have noted some of the points which he made, particularly the important ones. So he said, no, you give me. He was very particular that I should give him some additional inputs and data to enable him to reply to the points made by Sri N.K. Singh, and next day he precisely did that. My second interaction, official interaction with Sri N.K. Singh was when he became chairman of the FRBM review committee. We had long discussion. I was Secretary Economic Affairs. We had long discussion on the fiscal roadmap that India should adopt. In fact, he has written about it in his book, and that particular thing becomes, that particular chapter, those sections become very important in today's context, when government is also in a fiscal expansion mode to deal with the COVID-related challenges. I think post-COVID, once there is a containment of the health pandemic, the government will certainly have to spell out a fiscal roadmap to adhere to the debt to GDP target that Mr. Singh and his committee have set out. So in that context, this particular chapter and his experience in FRBM committee becomes very important. My third official interaction was as member of the 15th Finance Commission. If I start talking about the interactions that we had, in fact, I must, it will take a lot of time, but I must say that my presence in the Finance Commission for a little more than 1 year gave me opportunity to have very close interaction with Mr. N.K. Singh, and some of the major decisions which were taken in the late 90s and in the early part of this millennium, particularly things like the restructuring and the revival of the telecom sector, the structuring of the financing of the famous Golden Quadrilateral project, which was a major achievement of Prime Minister Vajpayee and his government. I think, the way he described some of this and how these policies were drawn up were in fact very useful to me. And talking about the book, Nick, I know I'm taking a little more time, but I'll finish in the next couple of minutes. About the book, four things, strike me. First is the title of the book. Somewhere in between, he says that it is half a century of being at the ringside. I think on many occasions, he was very much inside the ring, and gives an insider's perspective also, and watching the complex modality of decision making in India. I think that is the second point I want to mention, that the book gives, an average reader whether he is in government or outside. I think it presents a beautiful exposition in very simple style about how decision making, about the process of decision making in government, what a complex process it is. And he brings out very clearly that ultimately it is not just about facts and figures, but it's a judgment call. It's a judgment which the leader, which the minister, which the prime minister takes. That really matters a lot, and that point has been brought out very clearly. The third point, in fact, which I should have said in the beginning, is that the book sort of describes the evolution of the career of the civil service career, evolution of Mr. N.K. Singh as a civil servant, and on his path to excellence. His evolution as a civil servant is coinciding, and it has been presented along with the evolution of the Indian economy from a controlled economy to a liberalized economy. He talks about his experiences in the 60s and 70s. He talks about the post-91 reforms, and he has sort of talked about many other reforms thereafter. He has also talked about the reforms which have been, the major decisions which have been undertaken in the very, very recent years, in the last 4 to 5 years. So in that sense, and this is the fourth point, the book also has a lot of contemporary relevance, especially the chapter 13 and 14, which talks about recent years, and it talks about the pandemic and beyond. I think that makes the book very relevant in the present context. Knowing fully well the personality of Mr. N.K. Singh, who has this approach of never give up, I would like to, Nick, with your permission, read out the last 4 lines of his book in the epilogue. He goes on to say, and I read it. He says, "Our economic success will be the most lasting tribute to those who struggled to free the country from colonial subjugation, which tried to suppress the innate creativity of this ancient society." I think this is the message this is the signal, and this is the message which the author is giving in the book to the present generation and to future generations of administrators and policymakers. He has highlighted certain challenges which we encounter today in the context of COVID, but with that kind of an undaunting spirit which he has presented in the book, that kind of never give up spirit which he has presented in the book, I am quite confident that the policymakers of today, of government and other areas, the policymakers of today will be able to overcome the great challenges, the big challenges that we are confronted with, which arise from COVID and several other issues. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shanky.
Autobiographies are the most difficult books to review because you are not just reviewing a book, but reviewing a life. In N.K. Singh's case, that is easy. Unfortunately, the book only reached me yesterday evening, and it was my intention to look through the book and then prepare my remarks. I found this book so gripping that at 3 a.m, I was only halfway through and had not prepared my remarks. So I hope you will accept. As I read N.K.'s book, my favorite quotation about the political life in the United States kept running through my mind. Let me read it to you. It is from Theodore Roosevelt. "It is not the critic who counts, nor the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory or defeat. That, I think, is my friend N.K. Singh through his 50 years of public life. I have a piece of advice that I regularly give students, and I realize that there's no one I know whose career so embodies it. Students ask me, why should they become economists? And I say to them that if a doctor treats a patient gets better, and the doctor sees the patient, and the doctor has enormous satisfaction. If an economist contributes some idea or some input to some decision that causes, I put it in the US context, the unemployment rate to be 0.1% lower for 1 month, that is 100,000 families that have a livelihood who otherwise would not have a livelihood. And so if those of us who work on economic problems have less satisfaction of seeing immediate impact, we have the satisfaction of knowing that we are involved in steering a very large and very great ship. And in India, that must be that much more the case. And N.K. Singh has been part of so many, many voyages. That is an impression that comes through to any reader of this book. The stamina of this man. So many reports, so many decisions, so many inquiries, so many meetings, always, always trying to make the world a better place. I learned from this book much more than I knew before about India. I learned somewhat more than I knew before about N.K.'s remarkable career. But above all, I learned what it meant to be a public civil servant. And I learned about the nobility of that calling. And that message will resonate far beyond, should resonate far beyond those whose concern is with India. I also learned something about something that N.K. emphasized in talking about himself, his positive spirit and his capacity for diplomatic speech. And for those who do not know N.K. as well as I am just going to pass on 2 bits of glossary. The first is, if N.K. listens to you and you say something and he says, that is a very interesting idea, what you should hear is, I, N.K., have a better idea. If you speak with N.K. and he says, I really do seriously believe you should consider, that means you're a fool if you do not consider what is being suggested. The only privilege greater than reading this book was being reminded that I have been privileged to be friends with a man of such nobility, such gentleness, and in his quiet way, such greatness.
Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you for your very thoughtful reflections on the book. And
thanks, Larry, for those really, really affectionate, heartwarming remarks.
Thank you again, Larry, from us all. We had intended actually to have 1/3 of the panel looking back at the book and 2/3 of the panel looking forward, time of the panel looking forward to the future. We have just acted in a way, we've changed those proportions, so we are going to spend 1/3 of our time looking forward, and we have spent 2/3 of our time looking backwards. But I think on reflection, that's a very good outcome, and because we've learned a lot, so much of the career of NK and the person of the NK from the remarks that our three panelists have made. Very fond remarks, as you all heard. But let me go quickly now to the questions, and I'll have to ask our panelists now just to spend perhaps 4 minutes in asking those questions. We had planned a bit longer. Now, these are for you, Chanka, first, and there are 3 questions, and I'm going to shorten them just a little bit. One is from Savitri Kunadi, who is the former ambassador to the UN, Geneva, and to France. And she asks, essentially, how can multilateralism survive the onslaught of geopolitics and a more protectionist world? Our dear friend and my colleague at the LSE, Lord Meghnad Desai, asks a related question: what are the chances of achieving the goal of reforming the United Nations, which the Prime Minister of India mentioned in his recent UN address? And Mr. Naushad Forbes, Director of Forbes Marshall, asks about your perception, Jaishankar, as a former ambassador to the United States, on current US politics, and are the new divides and old prejudices stymieing the innovative leadership of the United States? So Jaishankar, those are huge questions, but if you could give us all 4 minutes to cover all 3 of those things, that'd be enormously appreciated.
Thank you. Let me start, Nick, with how does multilateralism survive the onslaught of geopolitics? I think multilateralism is in serious danger today because in the past, yes, you've had balance of power, which has its own dangers, and international politics moved into collective security, and then after the Second World War really produced genuine multilateralism. Today, we are seeing more and more balance of interests. Countries, the bigger countries even more so, really being very much more focused on their own interests. So my sense is today that if we have, first of all, to preserve multilateralism, keep it in play, really others need to step forward. It'll come in a sense to the question which Lord Meghnad Desai asked me. And some of it will have to be a recognition today that there is a diversity in the world, there are multiple points of view. If multilateralism goes towards one truth, becomes like a reflection of one view of what globalization is about, then I think that is putting multilateralism in as much danger as a balance of interests approach. So part of it is, if you democratize multilateralism, I would say it has a better chance of survival. Which brings me naturally to the second question, which is reforming the United Nations. Now, when it comes to reform, what we have seen now for 15 years, the UN reform process is a bit like Groundhog Day. Okay, every year they have the same conversations and start all over again. Now, if this is to be serious, it has to be a negotiation, and negotiations mean texts. Negotiations means records. Negotiations mean you take it from point A to point B, and then you pick up at point B and move to point C. And till now, the UN reform process hasn't adopted that pathway. So if we continue the way we are, and given the fact that there is less and less common ground, especially between the P5 the permanent five powers. Actually, we are going to make the UN less credible, less relevant, and I don't think the world wants that. I mean, if we are entering the Security Council as a non-permanent member on the 1st of January, and we are pushing for reform multilateralism, partly because, obviously it's in our own interest, but frankly, because we think it's good for the world, and we see a lot of tailwind out there. We see a lot of countries who would like us to move forward on this cause. Finally, the Naushad's question about, where is American politics going in a sense, and what does it mean for the world? It's an awfully complicated question. I'm sure Larry would do a better job answering it than me. But I see two big issues there. I mean, in a sense, we are looking at a post-globalization politics of the world's premier economy. In a sense, we are looking at the impact of rebalancing, economic rebalancing, political rebalancing, cultural rebalancing, geostrategic rebalancing. And together, if you look at the debates today in the United States, I think you can see, I mean, to begin with, this is a country which was always known for its optimism. I think that is singularly missing. We are looking, if you look at the debates on trade, debates on immigration, debates on security, debates on how they relate to the world. I think you can see these anxieties about globalization and rebalancing and the weight of the United States in the world today reflected out there. And I think all of us have an interest in this actually producing what, would be an outcome which is important for the world, because what happens in the US is not just an American issue. So I think we would all watch with great interest what happens on November 3rd.
Thank you very much, Jai Shankar. And we now turn to three questions for Shakti. The first, and I am going to shorten them slightly with apologies to those who made the questions. So Shakti, Uday Kotak, a great friend of all of us, Vice Chairman and Managing Director of Kotak Mahindra Bank, notes that the book indicates the important juncture in the financial sector, the importance of banking reforms. And Uday asks, what are your thoughts on the roadmap for reforms in India's banking and financial sector? Deepak Parekh from HDFC asks about the symmetry of monetary and fiscal policy. Can they be made more symmetrical? There again, in the context of the book's reference to regulation and liquidity in the financial architecture. And the third question from Jessica Seddon, fellow of the Charter Center for Global Affairs in Princeton, asks what measures is the banking system planning to put in place to ensure that there's adequate agile access to capital during the pandemic and post-pandemic periods, but keeping the banking system still safe. So again, big questions, and we all know that governors of central banks cannot say exactly what they're going to do next. But Shakti, with that normal constraint for a governor, what are your thoughts on these questions, please?
Thank you, Nick, and I'll be very brief and try to be as much to the point as possible. And so with regard to, Uday's question about the reforms in the banking and financial sector, I would like to say that at this juncture, it is very important in the context of banking and financial sector reforms. I think governance reforms in the governance of banks and non-bank finance companies, NBFCs as we know them in India, that is very important. When we talk of reforms in banking, it's people mostly sort of mix it up with ownership reforms relating to ownership of banking entities or non-banking finance entities. But I would like to look at it in today's context. And by today, I do not mean the post-pandemic or during the pandemic phase. I think this is the position post-global financial crisis. The issue of governance, especially in India, in banks and financial institutions, in non-bank finance companies has become very important. Banks which have robust governance practices, robust internal control systems, robust risk assessment, and which do not undertake a smart accounting, if I can put it that way. I think those banks are the ones which are never over leveraged, and they always survive. Not only survive, they grow in every crisis. So therefore today, irrespective of ownership of banks, and governance reforms is ownership agnostic. Governance reforms in terms of improving the governance practices in banks, the functioning of the boards, the functioning of the CEO, the functioning of the board committees, the risk assessment functions, all that becomes very important both for Indian banks and non-banking finance companies. Now coming to Deepak Parekh's point, fiscal policy and monetary policy being symmetrical, I would like to say that at the moment in India, both fiscal and monetary policies are in an accommodative stance. Both policies are working in close symmetry. In fact, both fiscal and monetary policies are today at the moment counter-cyclical. The fiscal policy, already this year's fiscal deficit of the central government and that of the state government, that is the deficit of the general government, will, it is already exceeding, and that is something known. The government has undertaken several measures in a very, very prudent and well-calibrated measure in the context of the pandemic. First, to provide financial support to the vulnerable sections of the society, and then provide certain kind of relief to, to the other segments of industry and business, like the small and marginal, the MSMEs as we call it, the medium, small and micro enterprises. And so far as the Reserve Bank is concerned, we are already in a monetary expansion mode. And in fact, we have undertaken several, we have deployed instruments and tools which were never, which were not in the toolkit of the RBI, but we are trying to constantly innovate with new instruments. So today, both fiscal policy and monetary policy in India are counter-cyclical. They are on an accommodative stance. Coming to the point which Jessica has asked about access to capital, I'll just like to mention that as soon as the COVID pandemic set in, we had in fact alerted and asked all the banks and non-banking finance companies to undertake internally themselves stress tests in the context of the COVID. And related to the stress tests, I have myself appealed and I have myself interacted with the banks and non-bank finance companies, and we have impressed upon them the need to build up proactively capital buffers and adequately capitalize their financial entities, whether banks or non-banks, so that not only they sort of strengthen their inherent resilience to tide over the financial stress, if any, but also to have adequate capital to support growth, to ensure that credit flow is maintained, especially to support growth and in a phase when the economy comes to a revival phase. And we are, I think, today in India at the doorsteps of a revival process after the effect, due to the effect of the pandemic. We are almost at the doorsteps of a revival process, and it's very important that financial entities have adequate capital, and many of them have already raised the capital. Others, both in the public and private sector, they are planning, and they would certainly do so in the coming months. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakti. Thank you. Larry, last 3 questions are for you. I'm getting an echo here. Is it possible to ask everybody to get Larry to mute? Yeah. Larry, thank you. That's much better. Larry, 3 questions, and I'll have to shorten them again as with the others. First one from our dear friend Singh, a great collaborator on financial sector reforms in the 1990s and other times with NK. Montek points to the goal shared by himself and NK of 7+% growth rate, points to the very different world now from 30 years or so ago with the rise of China, the challenges to globalization and so on. And he asks, given that many of the problems internally are still there, what would be your thoughts on the openness approach to foreign trade, foreign investment, foreign technology, and to capital. Do the earlier approaches on openness stand, or do they have to be modified in your view, and any recommendations for India? Jayant Sinha, Member of Parliament, Chairman, Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, and the former Minister of State for Finance and Civil Aviation, asks, and you mentioned the N.K., the meeting with Prime Minister Vajpayee. What are the areas do you think the relationship, Larry, with the United States, between the United States and India, have strengthened since the time of your meeting with Prime Minister Vajpayee? And also, as a former US Treasury Secretary, do you think that the US has an obligation for assuming a greater leadership role in reforming multilateral institutions and making the G20 more purposive? And the final question from one Vice Chancellor to the President Emeritus of Harvard University, from Professor Sunaina Singh, the Vice Chancellor of Nalanda University. This is a question from a very old university to comparatively young university, Larry, I'm sure you'd appreciate, is that what kind of collaborative arrangements between India and leading US academic institutions do you think would be mutually beneficial? That clarity, I would point out that Nalanda, you're talking about millennia, and with Harvard, just 100 or so, 200 years. So that's the difference in age, and but of course, great amounts to be learned one from the other. Larry, those are your questions. We're running pretty short of time. If you could cram it into 4 minutes, it'd be really appreciated.
Answering the questions in a different order than they were asked, I have been wholly unsuccessful to date, including with my children, but I believe as many American students as possible should have their study abroad time in India. No other place would so broaden their horizons while at the same time providing them with serious intellectual experiences which they could absorb in their native language of English. No other program would do so much to strengthen long-term ties between our two countries. And so I would like to see a massive joint initiative around American students studying in India. And at a minimum, I would like to see an Indian effort paralleling the Rhodes Scholars and the Schwarzman Scholars, directed at bringing scholars from all over the world to India. How could somebody like me presume to give Montek advice on the nuances of Indian openness policy? I continue to believe that India will make far more errors of being excessively closed over the next decade than it will of becoming excessively open. And so the right broad view is the view for which Montek and N.K. have long stood, of generating greater openness. More efforts to drive that openness towards longer term investment rather than shorter term reversible liquid flows is something that I think is very much worthy of consideration. But I think the broad orientation is correct. I think that growing emphasis on democracy, common security interests around developments on the Asian continent, mutual prowess with software drive substantially increased ties between India and the United States, and that should only continue. I would accept the basic idea, but resist the phraseology of the last part of the question. I do not believe that the United States has an obligation to lead the world. I do believe that the United States has an immense opportunity that is very much in its own interest to support and rejuvenate the Bretton Woods institutions and to enhance the G20. I believe a conspicuous feature of this moment is that while domestic actions in many countries, certainly including my own, certainly including Europe, in response to the COVID crisis, dwarf those in response to the great financial crisis of 2008. The international response in terms of replenishment of Bretton Woods institutions, in terms of special drawing rights, in terms of debt relief, in terms of commitments to reducing protectionism, in terms of enhanced trade finance, in terms of enhanced humanitarian assistance for the poorest countries, all of it is as nothing compared to what was embarked on in 2008. The so-called DSSI is a squirt gun against a potential conflagration. And it seems to me there's no more important task for a new administration, and I believe there will be a new administration in the United States, than lifting the international sights with respect to collective action. COVID should be something that brings mankind together, not something that pushes it apart. And of course, looking at you, the same can be said, Nick, of climate change. But if we have the spirit of N.K. Singh, we will move forward. And I would just conclude by saying to my many friends in this audience, this session is making me yearn for the moment when it is again possible for me to spend time with my many friends, none greater than N.K. Singh in India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. And I fully associate myself with your remarks about the G20 and magnitude of the challenge of COVID and climate, and of course the special role of N.K. And those of us who are not India, not on this panel, I think would share and offer whatever we can to help in that process. But this is a very special moment. And there's no time for questions, sadly, from the floor. Very limited time for my own comments. I just want to say two things, N.K., after reiterating with deep, deep thanks, is that the agenda that you set us is very clear and strong, and we've tried to pick it up today. You know, the agenda about security and growth and poverty reduction in a much more complex, multipolar, in many ways more difficult world. The agenda setting at the end on the social contract, the challenges that you point to on the environment, which Larry, including those which Larry just mentioned. But you have always been much more than asking questions. You've also been about what to do, how to do it, and when to do it. And you point out at the end that this is a critical decade. There's a great urgency here. But this is a decade when we see something very different from when you started your career. We see this as a decade and indeed a century of Indian leadership. And the people on this panel are marking that in many ways. But that transformation from India as a challenge to the economics of development and poverty reduction, which of course is still there, to an India which is leading the world in a critical decade, a critical century. That's a measure of what you, N.K., and those working with you have done over all these years. And that leadership of India is something that we will all look to, hope to benefit from, and do our best to support. So thank you, N.K. Thank you so much. I must pass back to Rini to introduce.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's very kind of you to sum up in that particular way, and don't know how to express my gratitude to all the panelists. Larry, who notwithstanding time difference has spent so much time and said such heartwarming, affectionate things. Shankar, I know, is being pushed for other events, as also Shakti. But thank you so much, Shankar, and thank you so much, Shakti, that sharing the bonds which you have had for a very long time, including some nice anecdotes about the Finance Commission. So thank you so much, and to you, Rini, to now take the final.
And my thanks in conclusion to Jai Shankar and Shakti. As always, sitting listening to you is one of the great privileges of being a friend of India and it's been a great learning experience. Thank you so much to both of you, as well as to Larry.
Thank you so much. It's been such a wonderful room filled with nostalgia and emotion and love and affection. So thank you, esteemed guests on the panel and Lord Stern. Thank you so much for running a tight ship for us. It was indeed a very engaging and wonderful discussion. And I know that we wanted to go on, but sadly we've come to the close of the evening. And I'd like to call upon Ms. Kiran Pasricha, Executive Director and CEO of Ananta Aspen Center, an independent and not-for-profit organization that focuses on leadership development, to give thanks. Ms. Pasricha. You need to unmute your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Rini. Thank you so much. It is truly very special for my institution, Ananta Aspen Center, and for me personally to be given this honor by Mr. N.K. Singh to thank all of you at the closing of this evening's release of Mr. Singh's autobiography. An autobiography is very special to the author, to friends, family, and admirers. And the significance of Mr. N.K. Singh's book, Portraits of Power, is reflected in the stature, high quality, and eminence of our panel of speakers today. Professor Larry Summers, Mr. Shaktikant Das, and Dr. Jaishankar. On behalf of everybody, I thank each and all of you deeply, sincerely, and profusely for your participation this evening. Each of you truly distinguished leaders in your respective areas have brought unique value to this occasion. Thank you very much, Minister of External Affairs, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and the former Treasury Secretary and President Emeritus of Harvard University. A special thanks to the lovely Nandini. Looking at the screen, I was not sure who was more proud, the grandfather of the granddaughter or the granddaughter of the grandfather. What a lovely, lovely part of the program that was today. To Rupa Publications and the team led by Mr. Mehra, a proud moment for all of you to have the book already at #1 on Amazon and other outlets. And thank you, Rini, for your moderation. Thank you, Lord Stern, for your high quality moderation. We could not have had a better moderator for such an eminent and distinguished panel of speakers. One last word and I am done. Mr. N.K. Singh is a friend, a well-wisher, and a supporter to countless people. He does not pass judgment, he does not criticize, he does not look down on anyone. In brief, he's a very, very special person, a friend to all, and a legend in his lifetime. And this special characteristic is fully reflected in the book, as also the fact that he is deeply thoughtful, a strong reformer, a strategist, and a renowned administrator. Mr. N.K. Singh's role in the National Highway Program, the opening of telecom, and the growing role of the private sector bear testimony to these qualities. So we wish you, sir, the greatest success with your autobiography, into which we know you have put your heart and soul and great effort and time. Congratulations and good luck. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pasricha. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to close this session. A reminder that the book is available on Amazon, Flipkart, and Snapdeal, as well as the website www.portraitofpower.in, and of course in all the leading bookstores. Thank you once again to everyone who joined us today in Mumbai and in other cities. Good night, and get yourself a copy.
Thank you.
People.